In this video, we're going to talk about how the new no-float container type gives advanced CSS developers more precise control over how CSS is used to lay out a component. So let's go now and quickly take a look at how this component renders, and we can see now that when we do that, we see that first name and last name are on the same line, and that's because there was no break after first name. Same is true of city and state, also on the same line because city and state, because there's no break after city. And we can also see that there's spacing between each of the controls and also the container edge and between each row of controls, and that spacing is controlled over here by this property called the A5 container width layout class padding. So if I were to go here and set that to a very, very high number, then when I render my component, I can see that we now have a total of 20 pixels on each side of the control. So there's 20 pixels around the whole inside border of this container, and then 20 pixels on the left and 20 pixels on the right, giving a total of 40 pixels between the two controls, and then there's 20 pixels underneath that control and 20 pixels above that control, giving a total of 40 pixels between each row of controls. So let's go back now to the default of 4 pixels, which is what's used by default for all components, which gives a nice attractive spacing. So now let's go and change the second container here from just a regular container to a new no-float container. So anything that's inside a no-float container basically does not use the A5CW layout class to wrap the controls, and therefore these breaks that are inside the control here are all meaningless. So if we go now to render this component here, we can see that now there are no breaks at all between the controls, and they all appear on their own line because each control is in its own div, and those divs are no longer floating. So the reason that this last name control appears to the right of the first name control, even though the control itself is in its own div, is that the CSS float attribute is being used to float the divs, and that's why this first container renders like this. But now in the second container here, we've turned off all of the floats for the controls that are inside the container, but we haven't turned off the float for the container itself, which is why we still see this 4 pixel border going all around the inside of the container. So now let's go to the container itself and turn off the float on the container there. So now we no longer have floats on the container or on its contents, and you can see now that the container now, because it doesn't have a float, stretches to the full width of the HTML page, and the border has been removed now. So there's no border at all around the inside of the container, and also the controls themselves are all touching each other. So there's no external spacing or padding that has been introduced by the UX. And now if you would apply your own CSS to these controls, you could control their position and spacing explicitly without having to worry about any extraneous padding or margins, etc., that is introduced by the UX component when the controls themselves are floated. So this gives advanced CS developers much more precise control over placement of controls in different no-float containers that are on a UX component. Thanks very much for watching.